Hi, my name is Kathleen O'Connor, and I'm the woman my husband tried for years to tear down. The day I lost my job, he laughed in my face. He called me useless, said he always knew I would fail. He thought that was the end of me, that I had nothing left. But what he didn't know was that months earlier, I had already sold a patent under my maiden name, a patent worth $96.5 million. So when he pushed for a divorce, thinking he was upgrading his life, I smiled, I signed the papers, and I stayed quiet. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade you'll ever carry. It was a Tuesday, and up until 3:15 that afternoon, it was ordinary in every way. The air in Portland, Maine, had that crisp edge you only feel in October, sharp enough to make you pull your coat tighter, but not yet cold enough for gloves. I remember because I had walked from the parking garage to the tall glass building where I worked, thinking about dinner. Roasted chicken, maybe potatoes, something warm, something simple. By 3:17, everything had changed. "Could you step into my office, Kathleen?" That was all my manager, Mr. Carter, had said. He didn't even look me in the eye when he called me in, and I knew. Before he spoke another word, before I sat in that gray chair across from his polished desk, I knew this wasn't just a quick chat. I had been with Harbor Biotech for 9 years. I had climbed from a junior research assistant to leading my own team. I had patents under my name, successful product launches, millions of dollars brought into the company. I wasn't just an employee, I was a builder, a creator, someone who made things happen. And yet, that day, all I heard were words like downsizing, realignment, not sustainable. My position was being cut, effective immediately. I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap. I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I didn't even ask why. I already knew. The company wanted to save money, and people like me, the ones who gave everything, were suddenly disposable. I nodded, thanked him for the opportunity, gathered my things, and walked out. The drive home was silent. The trees along the highway were bare, skeletal arms reaching into a pale sky. I had the radio on, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was the echo of Carter's words. "Your role is no longer sustainable." By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sun was already sinking low. Our house sat on a quiet street near the harbor. White siding, blue shutters, a porch with peeling paint, the kind of house you pass without remembering. The smell of rosemary and chicken hit me as soon as I opened the door. For one split second, I thought Richard, my husband, had cooked dinner, but then I saw the catering bags on the counter. "Some of the guys are coming over," he said casually, pouring bourbon into heavy glasses. "Figured we could all catch up." Richard's catching up usually meant showing off, bragging about whatever deal he had closed, whatever boat he was eyeing, whatever status he thought he had earned. When I walked into the living room, he was already sitting there with 2 friends, Greg and Tom. Glasses raised, cigars on the table. "Everyone, this is my unemployed wife," Richard said with a wide grin, as if he had just delivered the funniest joke of the evening. Greg gave a nervous chuckle. Tom avoided my eyes. I stood there, still holding my coat, and forced a polite smile. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Always told her the corporate world was too cutthroat. Guess I was right, huh?" The words hit like sharp stones, one after another. And then came Martha, his mother, sitting primly at the far end of the table, wine glass in hand. She'd been staying with us for a week, helping out. But her version of helping usually meant pointing out everything I wasn't doing right. "Well," Martha said, swirling her Chardonnay, "some women just aren't cut out for real responsibility. That's not a bad thing. It just means they're better suited for other roles." She didn't have to explain what other roles meant. I stayed quiet. Inside, every word cut. But I stayed quiet. Richard smirked. "Don't worry, honey. I'll handle the big stuff from now on. You can... I don't know." Join a book club." The bourbon glasses clinked, laughter filled the room, and I just stood there, listening. But what Richard didn't notice was the way my hand slid into my lap, pulling my phone out just enough to tilt the screen. And on that screen, glowing steady and silent, was a number that none of them knew about: $96,532,000. The patent sale had cleared months ago. Money deposited, locked away, hidden so well not even Richard could sniff it out. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and lifted my glass of water instead. Sipped slowly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I didn't storm out, because I didn't need to. The arrogance in that room was loud enough to drown everything else out. Richard laughing, Greg nodding, Tom pretending, Martha judging, and me silent. But for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt steady, centered, like a blade I hadn't unsheathed yet. When the friends left, Richard patted my shoulder like he was comforting a child. "We'll get through this, babe," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. I looked up at him, smiled, and said softly, "I'm sure we will." And in that moment, I knew exactly when I would let him lose everything. 2 weeks passed, 2 weeks of silence in our house. Richard left early every morning, polished shoes echoing on the wooden floor, his cologne lingering long after the door closed. He came back late, smelling of whiskey and expensive cigars, as though he had already begun rehearsing his new life. We barely spoke, but when we did, his words carried that new tone, a mixture of pity and triumph, like he had already won. Then one morning, he didn't come home alone. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside me, when I heard the front door creak open. His footsteps were heavy, confident. Another pair followed. Moments later, Richard walked in wearing a crisp navy suit. Behind him was a man I had never seen before. Sharp haircut, leather briefcase, the kind of lawyer who looked at people like contracts instead of human beings. "Morning," Richard said casually, as though this was just business. He slid into the chair across from me. The lawyer placed a stack of papers on the table, each page aligned with precision. "This won't take long," Richard began, his voice low, deliberate. "We've discussed what's fair. Given how different our paths are now, this is really a mercy. You should find someone who actually needs a partner." I looked at the stack. My name printed at the top, words blurred together, alimony waived, minimal support, no share of marital assets. The lawyer adjusted his tie. "This settlement offers you clarity," he explained smoothly. "No drawn-out court battle, no drama. You'll have your personal belongings, a modest stipend to help you start fresh, and—" He paused like he was rehearsing a line, "a clean break. A clean break." I ran my fingertips over the paper, feeling the cool texture, the faint ridges of the type. No mention of the years I supported Richard through failed ventures. No mention of the nights I stayed awake, balancing overdue bills while he slept like a king. No mention of the sacrifices, the loyalty, the years of my life spent holding together a man who thought the world owed him more. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. Instead, I reached for the pen. Richard's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. The lawyer glanced at him, the kind of silent exchange men share when they believe they've cornered someone. My silence, to them, meant surrender. My signature, they thought, was an act of desperation. But what they didn't know was that while their eyes lingered on me, I wasn't thinking about the papers at all. I was remembering my father's voice, a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. He used to say, "If someone's digging their own hole, don't take the shovel away. Just make sure they've got enough rope to finish the job." I signed each page with steady hands, slid the papers back across the table. The lawyer gathered them quickly, as if scooping up winnings from a card game. Richard leaned back in his chair, that smug smirk spreading wide across his face. "You're doing the right thing," he said, "for both of us." I met his eyes briefly, then looked away, letting him think his words had landed harder than they had. Inside, my mind was already cataloging every account password, every deed, every thread of his business accounts that he had forgotten I still had access to. I didn't need to fight today. I just needed to let the pieces fall exactly where I wanted them. "I'll start packing this week," I said quietly. "That's best," the lawyer replied, already standing, sliding the papers into his briefcase. They left as quickly as they had arrived. The house grew silent, heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked slowly through each room, opened drawers, pulled hangers from closets, folded my clothes neatly into boxes. But every time I slipped a sweater into a cardboard box, I tucked something else in with it. Bank statements, photocopies of contracts, receipts from purchases Richard thought I had forgotten, evidence. By sunset, the hallway was lined with neat stacks. To anyone else, they looked like the belongings of a woman starting over. To me, they were ammunition. I taped the last box shut, smoothed the strip down with the flat of my palm, and caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. My face was calm, almost serene. No one looking at me would guess the storm gathering beneath the surface. I walked back into the kitchen, ran my fingers across the counter where the morning had begun, where Richard had pushed papers toward me, convinced of his victory. It already felt like a different lifetime. Tomorrow, the house would be quieter without me in it. But tonight, it was holding a secret, because what Richard thought was defeat was only the silence before the tide turns, 3 months earlier. The room smelled of solder, coffee, and metal. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't the kind of laboratory you'd see in glossy brochures with white walls and spotless glass. This place was different. 2 long workbenches, shelves sagging under the weight of parts, wires, and old notebooks, a battered metal filing cabinet shoved against one wall, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, washing everything in that pale, relentless glow. But to me, it was heaven, because it was mine. The prototype sat in front of me, no larger than a paperback book, sleek casing, wires finally tucked neatly where they belonged, months of sketches, failures, and late nights condensed into something real. I pressed the final piece into place, heard the click, and in that sound, I knew it was finished. It wasn't perfect. No invention ever is at first, but it was functional, entirely functional, and it was mine. The door creaked open behind me. Still at it? It was Walter, 62 years old, retired from teaching engineering at the University of Maine, white hair that stuck up no matter how many times he combed it, and a heart too stubborn to stop tinkering. He carried 2 cups of coffee, set one down beside me. Didn't even ask if I wanted it. He knew I did. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, glancing at the scattered notes covering the bench. "Feels like it," I admitted, straightening my back. "But it works, Walter. I think it really works." He picked up the device, turning it in his hands like it was a puzzle box. His eyes narrowed, sharp even behind thick glasses. "You know what this means, right?" he said quietly. I nodded. I knew exactly what it meant. It meant freedom. It meant insurance against any storm. It meant I would never again be entirely at someone else's mercy. But it also meant something else. If Richard ever discovered this, it would never be mine. Not really. That's why I had already made the calls, already set the pieces in place. The week before, I had sat across from a woman named Ellen Harper, patent attorney, late 50s, sharp eyes behind rimmed glasses, the kind that missed nothing. She didn't waste words. She didn't waste time. We agreed on every detail. "File under your maiden name," she said. "Yes." Use the lab's address for all correspondence. Of course. No legal breadcrumbs, no mention of your husband. None. That night, I had driven home with the papers in the passenger seat. The streetlights cut golden stripes across the documents, like they were blessing each page. I had locked them away in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, dropped the key into my pocket, and exhaled. For the first time in years, I felt untouchable. The following morning, my phone buzzed, Ellen's name on the screen. "Ready for some good news?" she asked. I could barely breathe. "Please." The patent's approved. Sale finalized this morning. A medical tech firm out of Chicago. The figure is $96.5 million. The words hit me like a physical force. I gripped the edge of the workbench to steady myself. 96, my voice cracked. Million? Already secured in a trust, she continued calmly. Payment scheduled, you're protected. But remember, there's a confidentiality clause. If anyone tries to claim a share improperly, they lose everything. That includes him. I closed my eyes, the weight of it crashing over me. 96 million. Not lottery luck. Not inheritance. Mine. Every sleepless night, every sketch, every failed prototype, it had all led here. Walter leaned against the bench, arms folded, watching me carefully. When I hung up, he shook his head with a soft smile. "You just built yourself a lifeboat in a hurricane," he said. "Don't tell anyone, especially not him. Some storms are worth watching from the eye." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "It doesn't feel real." "It's real," Walter said. "And it's yours, don't forget that." That night, I stayed in the lab longer than I needed to. The city outside was still awake, cars hissing along wet streets, neon signs flickering, the hum of life carrying on. But inside that room, I felt apart from it all. I labeled the prototype, tucked design files into a fireproof folder, slid it into the bottom drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. I ran my hand over the smooth casing of the device one last time. My invention, my shield. When I finally stepped outside, the night air smelled of salt and diesel from the harbor. The sky was deep navy, the kind of color that makes you feel small and infinite at the same time. I drove home with the papers still on the seat beside me. The weight of them wasn't a burden. It was armor. Whatever storms were coming, I would not walk into them empty-handed. Weeks later, Richard started making small comments, little digs about how I worked too much, about how I never looked up from my notebooks. He thought he was clever. He thought I didn't notice the late nights, the unexplained absences, the perfume that wasn't mine, clinging faintly to his jacket. But I noticed everything. I just stayed quiet. Because silence, I was learning, could be a weapon. When the day came when I lost my job and he smirked in triumph, he thought he had won. He thought he had stripped me of everything that gave me value, but what he didn't know was that months earlier, in a cramped lab filled with wires and solder fumes, I had already secured my freedom. He thought I was sinking. In truth, I was already standing on higher ground. After the papers were signed, Richard moved fast. He didn't waste a single breath pretending to mourn what we had. Instead, he launched himself into his new life, parading Samantha around town like a prize he had won. It didn't take long for the pictures to surface. First, a rooftop bar in Miami, champagne spraying from a bottle while Samantha leaned into him, her lips glossed, her laughter frozen in the flash of someone else's camera. Then Aspen, a rented chalet, all wood and glass, firelight glowing in the background while they posed in matching designer coats. And later, New York, Samantha on his arm at a charity gala, dripping in diamonds she hadn't paid for. Each picture reached me one way or another. Friends tagged me by mistake. Acquaintances whispered gossip in the grocery store aisles. Someone always found a way to send me proof. They thought it would hurt me. It didn't. Because every photograph told me the same story. Richard was burning through money at a pace he couldn't sustain. He wasn't building anything. He was feeding a fire. and Samantha's taste for luxury poured gasoline onto it. I didn't rage. I didn't lash out. I waited, because I knew what he didn't. Those credit lines he loved so much, the ones he treated like his personal wallet, they were still tied to my name, and I had the power to shut them down. One Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. Do you have any idea how hard it is for me to keep my mouth shut? It was Dana, my best friend. She was the only one who knew about the patent sale, the only one who knew about the trust. I laughed softly. That's the point. Let them think I'm broke. It's driving me crazy, Kathleen, she said. People keep saying Richard is living his best life, and you're scraping by in that tiny apartment. I want to scream the truth. Don't, I said firmly. It's safer this way. She groaned into the phone. One day you're going to regret waiting too long, and I'll say, I told you so. But I didn't regret. Not yet. Because every day I stayed quiet, Richard grew bolder. Every day he flaunted his new life. He tightened the noose around his own neck. The turning point came in the most ordinary place, the produce aisle of the neighborhood market. Kathleen, a voice called. I turned to see Caroline, a woman I'd known loosely through business events. Not quite a friend, but the kind of person who thrived on gossip. We chatted about nothing at first: weather, groceries, her daughter's college applications. Then, as she leaned toward the apples, her voice dropped. I saw Richard last week, she said, her eyes lighting up with the thrill of sharing something delicious. He was bragging again, said life's never been better. But he mentioned something strange. He's been using the old business credit accounts. You know, the ones tied to both of you? I froze, my hand still hovering over a bag of oranges. Oh? I said carefully. I thought those were closed. She shrugged. Maybe he just hasn't gotten around to it. Then she smiled, patted my arm, and drifted away toward the bakery section. I didn't need to check. I knew she was telling the truth. Richard had always been careless with money, and if those accounts were still open, it meant I still had leverage. Serious leverage. That night, I sat in my apartment. The boxes were unpacked, the white walls bare. The city hummed outside my window, headlights gliding across rain-slick streets. I poured a glass of water and thought carefully. If Richard wanted to treat borrowed money like his personal wallet, then he was digging his own grave, and I had just been handed the shovel. The next morning, I walked into Scott's office. He was my financial advisor, sharp, calm, the kind of man who never raised his voice but always got things done. He closed the door as soon as I stepped in. You've decided, he said, studying my face. Yes, I replied, sliding into the chair across from him. Confirm every joint credit line Richard has touched since the separation, then close them. Freeze everything. Demand immediate repayment. Scott lifted his eyebrows. That will hit hard. Immediately. That's the point. He nodded once, turned to his computer, and typed. The screen filled with numbers. 3 open accounts. Balances so large my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a grim recognition of Richard's arrogance. He's been spending like it never ends, Scott said quietly. Travel, restaurants, boutiques, and this, he tapped the largest balance, is just what we can see. Freeze them all, I said. My voice didn't shake. He reached for a stack of forms. One by one, I signed. Each signature felt like closing a door Richard thought would always stay open. When the folder was ready, Scott handed it across the desk. Take this directly to the bank. They'll process it faster if you're in person. The corporate branch of the bank gleamed with polished wood and cold marble floors. The manager, a tall man with silver hair and a tie clip, greeted me with that professional calm that said he'd seen it all, until he saw the folder. He flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing. You understand, he said slowly. Once I process this, the accounts will be locked. No further charges, and repayment will be demanded within 5 business days. I understand. He hesitated a fraction of a second, then nodded. Very well. We'll process immediately. Within minutes, staff moved in quiet urgency. Papers stamped, phone calls made, screens updated. By the time I stepped back into the sunlight, the first ripples were already spreading. I didn't even make it halfway down the block before my phone buzzed. Richard. I didn't answer. 2 seconds later, a text flashed on the screen. What the hell did you just do? I stopped walking. The crowd flowed around me, strangers brushing past. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't type back, because the fact that he had felt it this quickly meant the freeze had already landed, and that was only the beginning. That night, I slept well for the first time in weeks, because Richard believed freedom was walking away with Samantha, the pretty prize on his arm. He believed freedom meant cutting me out and spending recklessly, but freedom wasn't his anymore. It was mine. And tomorrow, I would let him see just how fragile his new world really was. The morning light poured through my apartment window, pale and cool, the kind that makes everything look sharper. My phone buzzed before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Richard. Again. He had been calling nonstop since the freeze, first angry, then desperate, now almost begging. This time, his message was short. We need to talk, face to face. I didn't reply right away. I let him wait. I let the silence eat at him. Men like Richard hate silence more than anything. Finally, I typed, the cafe on Harbor Street, noon. The same cafe where, months earlier, he had leaned back in his chair, introduced Samantha with a smug smile, and told me he felt free. I chose it for a reason. By noon, I was already there. The cafe smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee. Sunlight spilled through wide windows, catching the steam rising from cappuccinos. I asked the hostess for a table in the center of the room, not in a corner, not hidden, right where everyone walking in would see me first. I wanted him exposed. I set my bag neatly on the chair beside me and folded my hands on the table. The waitress came by, young, with a warm smile. Coffee, she asked. Black, please, I said. No cream, no sugar. Simple. Director. 10 minutes later, he appeared. I saw him before he saw me pacing outside, running a hand over his face. His navy suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked. Dark circles pooled under his eyes. He looked nothing like the man who had smirked through our divorce papers. When he finally spotted me, he didn't bother with hello. He strode straight to the table. You need to undo what you did, he snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw glances from nearby tables. I leaned back in my chair, calm, deliberate. Have a seat, Richard. Let's talk like adults. He sat, but his hands were already clenched on the table. The credit lines, he hissed. You froze them. Do you have any idea what you've done? I can't move money. I can't make payments. You're strangling me financially. It's perfectly legal, I said softly, and exactly what any responsible person would do when their name is still tied to accounts someone else is burning through. His jaw tightened. You don't understand. Oh, I understand, I interrupted. My voice stayed even. Flights to Miami, weekends in Aspen, designer clothes, all while parading around town with your new partner. And all of it, Richard, was on credit with my name still attached. He blinked, caught off guard. His mouth opened, then shut. She has nothing to do with this, he muttered. Of course she does, I said, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. She's been right there beside you for every charge. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. His lips pressed into a thin line. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down gently. Richard ordered nothing. I stirred my cup slowly, the silence stretching, working on him. He shifted in his seat the way people do when they realize the script they've written is falling apart. Finally, his voice dropped, controlled but trembling underneath. If you don't reverse this, I'll go public. I'll tell everyone what you've been hiding. You mean you'll tell lies, I said calmly, and you should try, because when you do, I'll release every financial record I kept, every transfer, every receipt. I'm sure the IRS would find some of them. interesting. For just a second, his face went pale. He opened his mouth to fire back, but that was when the door opened, and in walked Samantha. She froze halfway to the counter, clearly not expecting to see us sitting together. Her eyes darted from him to me, suspicion blooming across her face. I smiled warmly like I'd been expecting her. "Good morning, Samantha," I said, my tone polite but edged with steel. Her cheeks flushed. "You two know each other?" she asked Richard. "Oh, yes," I said, still smiling. "We've met before, under circumstances she probably doesn't brag about." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Samantha hesitated, then slid into the seat beside him, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her designer purse. The three of us sat in brittle silence. The cafe's background chatter seemed to fade. Then I decided the time had come. I reached into my bag, pulled out a thick envelope, and placed it on the table. No flourish, no slam. Just enough weight so they both noticed. Richard's eyes narrowed. Samantha's gaze flicked nervously between the envelope and my face. "What's that?" Richard asked, his voice strained. "That," I said evenly, "is a notarized summary of the sale of my patent." His brow furrowed. Samantha's lips parted. "Patent?" he repeated, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. "Yes," I replied calmly. "The one I developed before we ever met. The one I sold months ago for $96.5 million. The number landed like a thunderclap. The cafe seemed to go quieter, though I knew it was only in my head. Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. Samantha's face went pale, her hand tightening on her purse strap until her knuckles whitened. "And here's the part you'll love," I continued, still calm, still steady. "Because it was created and sold before our marriage, it isn't marital property. By law, Richard, you have no claim, not one penny." Richard's face drained of color. "You're lying," he whispered. "You're welcome to check with my attorney," I said, sliding the envelope an inch closer to him. "It's all there. Dates, signatures, wire transfer records, and you'll notice my name is the only one on every page." Samantha swallowed hard. "So you've had this the whole time?" I nodded once. "And while we're on the subject," I added, "the credit freeze you're so angry about? That was just step one. By the end of this week, every account tied to our names will be reviewed. Every debt, every overdraft, every luxury expense you thought no one would notice." Richard leaned forward, trying to summon the anger he always relied on. But desperation bled through the edges of his voice. "You can't just—" "I already did." Samantha's eyes darted to him, panic flickering across her face. I saw the calculation in her expression, the dawning realization of what she had walked into. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against tile loud in the tense silence. "Thank you," I said, rising to my feet. My voice was level, even kind. "For the closure. I wish you both the very best." Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. I left the envelope where it was, walked out without looking back. The air outside was cool and clean. Each step away from the cafe felt lighter, freer. For years, Richard had defined me as weak, as a burden, as something to be discarded. But here, finally, he had seen the truth. I wasn't the one left empty-handed. I was the one who had already walked away with everything that mattered. The courthouse in Portland looked colder than I remembered. Tall glass doors, marble stairs polished by decades of footsteps, the kind of place where lives are rewritten in signatures and stamped documents. I parked a few blocks away, gave myself time to walk. Each step across the brick sidewalk felt measured, steady, like I was walking directly into the next chapter of my life. Inside, the air was hushed. The shuffle of papers, the echo of heels, lawyers whispering in corners. A clerk nodded me toward the second floor. I didn't need the directions. I'd been here before, just never for something this personal. My attorney, Helen, was waiting in the hallway, calm as always, coffee cup in hand. her gray suit as crisp as if it had just come off the hanger. "Morning," she said softly, her voice steady. "Are you ready?" I nodded. Across the hall, Richard was already there, standing tall, his arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. His lawyer, young, slick, hair combed within an inch of its life, hovered beside him, whispering strategy. Richard glanced at me like he was looking at a piece of furniture he was about to sell. Briefly, without attachment. The judge called us in. The proceedings began almost immediately. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber, neutral, deliberate, reading line after line of the settlement. Minimal support. No alimony. No share of assets. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. Each time my name was mentioned, I simply nodded, signed where Helen slid the papers in front of me. Richard's lawyer stole glances at me, clearly waiting for an objection, waiting for me to fight over something. I let every term stand. I even declined the offer of spousal support outright. It was almost funny watching the satisfaction bloom across Richard's face. His shoulders loosened, his jaw unclenched. To him, this wasn't just a legal win. This was confirmation of every story he had told himself about me, that I was replaceable, that I was weak. "Guess she just wants out," his lawyer murmured under his breath, but loud enough for me to hear. Richard chuckled. Helen didn't react. Her face stayed unreadable calm, but I knew she understood what they didn't. My life wasn't balanced on these papers. When the last signature was in place, the judge nodded. Papers shuffled. Just like that, years of marriage dissolved in less than 20 minutes. We stood. Chairs scraped the floor. At the door, Richard leaned toward me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Don't spend it all in one place," he said, coated in mock sympathy. I didn't stop walking. Outside, the sun hit the marble staircase so brightly it made me squint. Helen touched my arm gently. "You're free," she said. Then she stepped aside, letting me take in the moment. I lingered, breathing in the cool air, watching people rush along the street with their own troubles. For me, the noise of the city felt distant, like I was standing inside a quiet bubble of freedom. That's when a clerk approached, a manila envelope in his hands. "This came in for you this morning," he said. His tone was neutral, but his eyes flickered for a fraction of a second before he moved on. I carried the envelope down the stairs, waited until I reached the sidewalk before opening it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, confirmation of funds deposited, the trust, the sale, the numbers lined neatly with commas and zeros. $96,500,000, proof of everything I had built, proof of everything Richard would never touch. I folded the paper carefully, like it was something sacred, and tucked it into my bag. By the time Richard sat down to his victory dinner that night, probably raising a glass to his new life, I knew the truth. He thought I was leaving with nothing. But in reality, I had already walked away with more than he could ever imagine. That evening, I moved into my new apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't grand. White walls, one couch, a small kitchen table, a bed. No article, no statement furniture. It was exactly what I wanted. Plain enough to convince the world I was scraping by after the divorce. And that was the story I wanted them to believe for now. The nights were quiet. I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching headlights weave through the streets below. My phone buzzed most evenings, Dana calling, checking in, sometimes scolding me for being too patient. "You're sitting on a fortune," she said once. "You could buy a penthouse tomorrow." I could, I admitted, but that would ruin the story they're telling themselves, and I want them to believe it a little longer. "Why?" she asked, exasperated. "Because people get careless around someone they think is weak," I replied softly, "and Richard's not done making mistakes yet." I wasn't wrong. Within weeks, whispers reached me. Pictures of Samantha dripping in new clothes, Richard grinning behind the wheel of a rented sports car, Trips, dinners, celebrations. The money was flowing out faster than it was coming in, and I knew soon he would reach for those credit lines again. Except this time, the safety net was gone. This time, he would feel the ground give way beneath him, and when he did, I would be ready. The news reached me on a Monday morning. Richard had lost his home. Not the grand estate we once shared, but the luxury apartment he rented after the divorce. The bank had repossessed it. Before long, the photos disappeared from social media. No more sports cars, no more silk dresses for Samantha. The glossy smiles faded into cryptic posts, complaints and blame. A mutual friend told me Samantha had left, not because love had run dry, but because the credit cards no longer swiped. Richard hadn't just lost. He had dug the hole himself and fallen straight in. I didn't feel joy, no rush of revenge. Instead, a lightness spread through me, as if a heavy door had finally closed. I was no longer the woman waiting on a worn chair in a big house, listening to her husband return with laughter that wasn't hers. I no longer had to absorb the cutting remarks about being useless. Now I was free, and wealthy in a way he could never have imagined. I began to rewrite my life, not with fast cars or jewels, but with small, meaningful choices. A new apartment, spacious and filled with light. A quiet library corner where I could spend hours reading. Short trips to Vermont, to Maine, to Boston, not to show off, but simply to savor. I funded a scholarship at my old university anonymously because I wanted students like the younger me, full of ideas but short on money, to have a chance. When I signed the first check, my hands trembled, not from the loss but from the realization I had turned pain into strength and strength into freedom for others. One autumn afternoon, I sat with Dana on my porch. Leaves drifted softly in the breeze. "You did it," she said, handing me a cup of tea. "You got away from him, away from all of that." I smiled. Not just away, beyond. She nodded, her eyes shining with pride for me. "And Richard?" I heard he moved out of state, picked up odd work at a small firm. No more loud parties, no more glamour. Just a man clinging to whatever dignity he had left. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't even care. He was simply a closed chapter, a piece of the past I had left behind. At night, I sat by my window, moonlight spilling across the city skyline. I thought about the road I had walked from the discarded wife, dismissed and betrayed, to a woman in control, strong, independent, with nearly $100 million at her back, yet refusing to let money define her. I whispered to myself, I survived. I triumphed. And now, I am truly free. In the end, Kathleen's story wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her worth. She walked away from betrayal not broken, but stronger, wiser, and truly free. Her journey reminds us that no matter how deeply we're underestimated, we hold the power to rewrite our lives. If this story moved you, remember strength often comes in silence, and the sweetest victories are lived, not shouted. Thank you for watching, and may Kathleen's courage inspire you to never forget your own.